So in this incredibly fractious and fractured world, it's an appropriate moment for a museum like ours to be sharing Qur'ans with the American public. But it's also an appropriate moment for scholars like yourselves to be gathering, because I at least can sense a turn in the field, or perhaps several turns. Now, we began on Thursday evening with a talk by Jane McAuliffe. She refreshingly started with questions from the audiences she's encountered on many occasions. And that reminded us of the very purpose of this exhibition. It's intended to be outward-looking, embracing, not closed. Because it's really necessary now for museums like ours to engage with publics hungry for answers about Islam. Jane, especially through the biographies she presented, alerted us, reminded us how Islam and the Qur'an were in the thoughts of the founding fathers. Also reminded us in very poignant ways how the Qur'an was a central source of solace and fortitude for some of those who were enslaved. The conference that followed that keynote lecture has touched on several themes of importance for the public. And I'd like to identify four. The first is what I'll call chronological clusters. 3 moments of extraordinary change. One in the 7th century, late 7th century, another in the 11th, and another in the late 14th and into the 15th. So we heard from François Desroches, who looked at some of the earliest productions of manuscripts, Qur'ans. And in some ways he reflected on the changes that have happened in our understanding of these over the last 40 years since the great exhibition at the British Library in 1976. For now, I think there are few who would not acknowledge that some of the very earliest manuscripts are really earlier than anyone was once brave enough to suggest. So whatever reservations you may have about C14 dating, the Hijazi manuscripts are being dated to within a generation or two of the death of the Prophet. It was fascinating to hear that, for example, and I don't know if I can pronounce this, it's the most polysyllabic reference to a Qur'an I know, the Parisino Petropolitanus copy had perhaps as many as 5 different scribes. But we also heard, as we heard today from Alain Georges, that we have in the Dome of the Rock a fixed point. Not only the great mosaic inscription, but also the bronze plaques. A fixed point that helps locate in time what François called the Umayyad codices. There are decorative links to the mosaics of the Umayyad period in the Illumination. Most importantly, links to the inscriptions. It illustrates what was a recurrent theme through this conference, particularly the first day, which is the intersection of patronage and artistic creativity that created nodal points in the evolution of the art of Quranic manuscripts. It also illustrated another point that came out in several of the talks, that is the connection between calligraphy and monumental architecture. And so a question was asked, what might have prompted the introduction of the horizontal format for many Qur'ans in the Umayyad period? And one suggestion was that it was intentional to differentiate the Qur'an from the vertical format of biblical codices or the scroll format of Torahs. But I just wonder if for a minute we shouldn't also consider that at a time when there was a clear interchange between manuscripts and architecture, when there were what Francois called script designers, designers who produced the models for the inscriptions that would have been produced for the Christian mosaicists to follow, whether at that moment the horizontal format of many Umayyad inscriptions opened the eyes of those writing the books to the possibilities of the horizontal format for the codex. In other words, here at a very early moment, we can see the development of the physical form of Qur'an manuscripts, not solely within the arena of manuscript production, but within a more fertile and cross-fertilization between different arts. The point was also raised about these new mushafs being large, having to be large and beautiful, and I think we saw today again that ponderous and monumental codex from Cairo. And in this, we certainly get a sense of the importance of imperial sponsorship. Hearing from Francois and then again from Alain about the way in which public readings of the Quran under Abdul Malik in Medina were so important an introduction. We should reflect then on Abdul Malik's almost obsession with the power of visual expression, not just in architecture. Just think of his transformation of coinage. A reform of the appearance of the Quranic codex at this time would make perfect sense. That opening talk by Francois also set the scene for another theme that many others have picked up on: the enormous scale of investment of time and resources to produce some of the greatest manuscripts that we've seen, some in the exhibition. It was fascinating to hear from several speakers about the exponential increase in the size of some of these productions, something that led under the Abbasids to manuscripts, the ex-plano manuscripts, where each folio is a full parchment. Come back to that photo from Cairo. But equally memorable as that photo was the fact that it would take a flock of 1,000 sheep to produce that. Now, this exhibition takes place, and it intentionally takes place, a decade after we had an extraordinary exhibition on the very earliest Bibles. It was an exhibition called In the Beginning, Bibles Before the Year 1000. The purpose of that exhibition was to show the evolution of what we call and think of as the single volume Bible. It was an extraordinarily slow evolution. More than 300, possibly 400 years, in which what we think of as a standard book actually finally took its standard form. Compare that then to the rapidity with which the Quran, both as text and form, evolved. Even the canonicity of that Bible text was in dispute until the late 5th century. Early copies have the Epistle of Barnabas. How often is that part of the standard now? And while we know that in the year 331, the Emperor Constantine commissioned Bishop Eusebius to have 50 Bibles produced, clearly we know to disperse to churches, nothing compares to the fixity, to the certainty, to the confidence and sheer scale of early Quranic production. And there was a fascinating, telling statistic just taken from the holdings of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. 80 Carolingian Bibles gathered from multiple places, compared to 250 taken from the single mosque of Amr in Fustat. So in that first chronological cluster, at least my eyes were opened. And I think that was certainly true of the second chronological cluster, Alia's wonderful look at the imperial Ghaznavid Qur'ans. It's, I think, extraordinary how a coherent body of material, some with really extraordinarily good documentation, has actually never been looked at comprehensively in this way. Here we have the name, the nisbah of the copyist. We have evidence of a family tradition of bookmanship, calligraphy, illumination, binding, that led to manuscripts that belong and perhaps even prompted another great turn in production. For here was a master who could, in almost playful fashion, express the words of the Qur'an in multiple scripts. And yet in doing so, he achieved it without that sense of distraction, but with a perfect mastery of poise. And here, the vertical format made perfect sense because it allowed for the play of different scripts, but without collision. Chronological clusters. Again, Alison gave us a wonderful overview of Mamluk Quran production that began with influences from Baghdad, especially in the Quran of Baybaz al-Jashnagir. And if any of you who are over here for a short time have a moment to go to New York, parts of that extraordinary Quran are on show at the Met in their show on Jerusalem. But we also saw the triumph of Muhaqqaq Jali, another link perhaps between Quranic calligraphy and architecture. And we saw the linkages with other arts. Remember the doors of Salih Talai of 1303. And we also saw the substantial transformation of Mamluk Qur'ans in terms of illumination and bindings in the second half of the 15th century, with an influx of inspiration and techniques from Turkoman Iran. And this happened at the very moment there was a similar transformation in the arts of the book in Ottoman Istanbul. So, in other words, we have fascinating examples of the migration of people and skills transforming local traditions. And yet also in the period of Qaitbay, we have the harmony of arts across all sorts of media in Mamluk Cairo, that in great part derived not from this importation, but from older Mamluk traditions. If chronological clusters is one theme that linked some of our early papers, artists is another theme. As we begin to wrest the scribes and others from anonymity. In some cases, there's little more than the name, some scraps of information, but in others, we have larger biographies. So Nuran's presentation, and I especially loved her answers to the questions, raised all sorts of questions about the validity of some of those biographies, about Yaqut and the myth of his 6 pupils. But this wasn't an exercise in demolishing assumptions. It was a positive exercise in patiently compiling a reliable corpus of documentary and calligraphic evidence, of showing how Yaqut was not so much the inventor of a new script, but maybe what we might call the perfecter. The person who imposed a complete consistency of letter forms, and yet, if I can add, someone who never let that consistency seem like rigidity, because he infused his work with such lightness and such sweeping rhythms. Perhaps, as Nuran suggested, his invention was that of a reed pen, thinner than any used before, one that became almost like a baton in which he conducted the music of his writing. Nuran also provided a sense of the methodology she's used for ascribing manuscripts to Yaqut, but also the methodology for dismissing items. That leaves us, unfortunately, with a certain 9 from a rather large mob of 133, but it's a great basis. But this talk also raised the critical question. We have no evidence of major imperial patronage for Yaqut in the latter years of his life. That's quite different from the picture that we have of his 6 disciples who received extraordinary imperial patronage. So it raises the question of what was it that led others, and by others I don't just mean the Iranian, but also the Ottoman tradition that Nuran traced back to Abdullah Saydafi. What led Iranian and Ottoman, and as Alison Ota reminded us, the Mamluk too, to see Yaqut as a fountainhead? In other words, there seems to be almost a disjunction between the 9 manuscripts that can confidently be ascribed to Yaqut and his monumental importance in the way in which later generations saw the evolution of calligraphy. How do we reconcile the humility of these surviving 9 manuscripts and also what we know of his biography with the enormous impact he had? I think this raises questions that we need to grapple with, and I wonder whether, perhaps like Sheikh Hamdullah, part of the influence was something to do with his own personality. The third great topic, and I think one of perhaps the most lasting outcome from this conference, is what I'll call the sensory turn. Now, Sheila, in talking about these extraordinary manuscripts made by Yaqut's successors, reminded us of that interplay between calligraphers and Ilkhanid patronage. That harks back to the Umayyad and Abbasid moments where imperial patronage provided the resources for something extraordinary in scale. The wonder is how that scale never actually seems to overwhelm, but remarkably liberates the word. In other words, think about the Al-Jaytu Qur'an, the way in which the sheer size, those empty spaces around the words, mean that there is a sense of breath that comes from the pages of the Al-Jaytu Qur'an. And that leads me to this aspect of the, I think this really important aspect of the symposium, the sensory turn. We saw that brilliantly in Elaine's close-up investigation of the Ruzbihan manuscript. I think none of us have ever appreciated the delicacy and the imaginative richness of that decoration, and yet somehow, again, that sense of poise. But Sheila also drew our attention to the sensory turn when she talked about an Ilkhanid Qur'an being kept behind a locked grille and being brought out for reading during Ramadan. 3 readers to read from it all day and night. And at night, by the light of a beeswax candle. She talked about the candlelight flickering over the gold and the polished pages as they turned. And there was again reference to incense that we heard about again this morning. This leads to thinking then as we heard so clearly from several speakers this morning, about Quranic manuscripts not as static monuments to the word, but activators. Just as Muslim prayer is a sequence of stasis and movement, so too the Qur'an needs to be understood as something that started as an oral message, but's now communicated through eyes and ears. Orality and aurality, eyes and ears. It's this activation of the senses that we heard about from Alain and Nina this morning. Made me wonder about the role of the haptic as well, but that's perhaps more difficult to What I particularly appreciated this morning was really hearing about sonority as an instantiation of the revelation. It's not just an activation of the senses, but it's an instantiation of the blessing. We heard too about this reading within a building and within a city context, this experiential dimension. I think this appreciation of the wider realm of the Qur'an, its performative aspects within the mosque, is really one of the great achievements of this conference. We also had two papers that looked at very different aspects. They looked at selections of the Qur'an and at translations, about creating moments of concentration and moments of understanding for Muslims who weren't necessarily Arab speakers. In one sense, Unver's paper itself underlined interlinearity because it adopted such a different approach to some of the other papers. But it raised, as did Simon's, the question of the untranslatability of the Qur'ans, its ability to unite, but also the need to recognize the multiplicity of nations and languages embraced by Islam. And we heard here, even if it's not fully answered, about the politics of selection. And that reminded me, of the story that we heard about Ilber Ortaylı, the director of the Topkapi Saray, giving a facsimile of volume 8 of the Ghaznavid Qur'an to the Majlis in Tehran, and how the speaker of the Majlis talked about the Qur'an bringing different sects together, different sects of Islam. But we should end perhaps with the poignant truth that this has not always been the case. For there was the Damnatio Memoriae, in which the Ghaznavid Qur'an itself had Abu Bakr's name and Uthman's name changed, and even the Waraq's name changed from Uthman to Ali. So beauty, all art, can be produced for political purpose. And what we can see, it's not just the original purpose, it can be repurposed for political ends. So thank you all very, very much for an incredibly stimulating 2 days. And can we actually have a huge round of applause for Must?